The Supreme Court was dead silent when Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett walked to the stand. Her navy suit looked crisp against the dark wood panels that seemed to whisper stories of old court battles. The bright lights made it feel like a stage, with the future of voting rights hanging in the balance. Just as she was about to speak, Justice Clarence Thomas, known for being quiet, leaned forward and smirked. His deep voice filled the room. Congresswoman Crockett, your understanding of constitutional law seems pretty basic for someone pushing voting rights. Maybe you're confusing being an activist with actually knowing what you're talking about. Everyone gasped. Court clerks stopped writing, and the other justices shifted in their seats. Thomas kept going, his voice dripping with a surprising amount of disrespect. I think you should go back to the basics before you try to lecture this court about the Constitution. The room buzzed with whispers. The legal experts in the audience looked shocked. No one could remember a justice attacking a lawyer like that during an argument, turning it into a public takedown. Crockett gripped the podium, her knuckles white, but her face was calm. Her eyes didn't show fear, but more like anger. Thomas leaned back, looking satisfied, sure she would back down. He was wrong. She adjusted her mic, took a breath, and gave an answer that would shock the justices and become a symbol of courtroom courage. This moment would be remembered as one of the most intense clashes in Supreme Court history, but that was just the beginning. It exposed problems within the court and started a national debate that no one expected. Hey there! Before we get into this crazy situation, hit the like button and subscribe for the real political scoop the mainstream media misses. We're talking power plays, secret plans, and wins that change everything. Turn on notifications so you don't miss our next big story. Justice Clarence Thomas, appointed way back in 1991 by President George H.W. Bush at 43, wasn't just a judge. Now, at 76, his way of thinking has formed big rulings for over 30 years, touching everything from affirmative action to gun rights, always sticking to what the original writers wanted. He grew up poor in Pinpoint, Georgia, a small gullah place where he faced racism and loss. His rise to the top is an American dream story, but it's been full of issues. People see him as divisive. There were questions about gifts from rich friends, his wife Ginny's role in the January 6th events, and claims he's become too politically aggressive. He's known for being quiet during arguments. He once went 10 years without asking anything, earning him the name the Sphinx. So, when he suddenly went after Crockett, it was like a volcano exploding. He was already irritated that morning, glaring at voting rights supporters. His fellow conservative judges, Alito, Gorsuch, Barrett, and Kavanaugh, asked tough questions, but none personally attacked Crockett until Thomas broke his silence, questioning her abilities as if her presence insulted him. Some believe Thomas saw this case as a last stand for his views on election fairness, a way to strengthen state power against the federal government. But his outburst revealed the deep issues of race, gender, and power that have been under the surface of the court for years. These tensions would show some alliances and make his strongest supporters feel insecure. Stay tuned to see how one judge's anger almost ruined everything. Rep. Jasmine Crockett, a vibrant Texan at 43, is part of a new wave of progressive black women changing American leadership with bold intelligence. She wasn't born into privilege. She earned her stripes defending the underdog for over a decade. She fought voter suppression in courtrooms down south, turning complicated legal battles into stories everyone could grasp. Before Congress, Crockett worked hard, graduated with honors from law school, and became a prosecutor turned defender. She won cases against unfair systems that silenced minorities. Her tough style in congressional hearings, where she grilled witnesses, went viral on TikTok and Instagram, making her a role model. She was asked to argue this important voting rights case because she's a pro. She's won some big battles against gerrymandering and strict ID laws. Crockett wasn't just arguing legal points. She was standing up for the people she'd defended. Elderly black voters turned away and young Latinos whose votes disappeared because of unfair laws. This case, Johnson, the Electoral Commission of Wisconsin, was huge. It challenged new rules that people said were like modern poll taxes, hurting minorities, low-income folks, and the elderly by demanding IDs that didn't reflect real life, and poverty or bureaucracy. If the court said these rules were okay, other conservative states might do the same, silencing up to 10 million voters in future elections, solidifying one-party rule. If the court struck them down, it could fix some of the damage done to the Voting Rights Act. The courtroom was buzzing. Big names like Derek Johnson Johnson from the NAACP were there with politicians from both parties. Reporters from everywhere were covering it live. Outside, protesters clashed, their shouts echoing inside. For Thomas, it was about protecting state power over elections. For Crockett, it was about her duty to the people she represents. It got so personal that it forced everyone in the court to face some hard truths about prejudice and respect, truths that will stick around and shape future decisions. You won't believe how one argument changed everything, even the minds of the most conservative judges. The air was thick with tension. Everyone watched Crockett, but she stayed cool. She organized her papers with a faint smile, like she knew what was coming. Unlike other lawyers who crumbled under pressure from the justices, Crockett seemed energized. She stood tall, ready for a fight, a readiness born from the discrimination she'd faced. Justice Sotomayor shot her a quick, concerned look, probably remembering her own struggles as the court's first Latina. Ketanji Brown Jackson, the newest black justice, looked neutral, but her eyes showed she stood with Crockett, understanding the battles against doubt. Chief Justice John Roberts, always careful about court rules, leaned in to talk quietly with Elena Kagan. He looked uneasy as the discussion got personal. The courtroom changed from its usual calm to a place of real anger. Everyone felt they were about to see a big break from the court's traditions, something people would talk about for a long time. Congresswoman Crockett, Thomas went on, his voice sharp. Your arguments aren't strong. Your brief reads more like a political statement than a legal paper. The tension grew. Kagan shifted in her seat, and Roberts frowned harder. Jackson kept watching Crockett, as if sending her strength. Crockett didn't move, staring at Thomas with the intensity of someone who'd faced worse. She didn't flinch or look scared, just confident, like she knew how to use silence as a weapon. Thomas, thinking she was giving in, pressed on. Your references to Baker v. Carr and Reynolds v. Sims miss simple points that anyone should know. Maybe if you spent less time seeking cameras and more time learning the law, you wouldn't make these mistakes. People started murmuring loudly. This kind of personal attack was almost unheard of in the court. Bailiffs looked nervously at Roberts, waiting for him to step in, but he seemed frozen, letting the moment stretch out. Thomas really went for it, waving Crockett's brief around like it was illegal, flipping through it with this over-the-top show of dislike. I see at least 17 times you messed up the case law in here, Congresswoman. 17! And your take on Crawford versus Marion County is just wrong. It actually backs up the voter ID rules you're trying to get rid of. Next to him, Justice Samuel Alito nodded a little like he was egging him on. I agree with Justice Thomas. You're brushing aside the state's super important interest in fair elections, something this court has said is true over and over. It was a coordinated attack from the conservative side, not like their usual detached questioning. It felt like they were trying to publicly shame her. Justice Neil Gorsuch, usually on their side, wouldn't even look up from his notes. He looked uncomfortable. Crockett stood firm at the podium, her hands steady, looking like she'd been waiting for this. She'd spent weeks studying Thomas, figuring out how he'd attack, like a general planning for war. Now, as everyone waited to hear what she'd say, she felt like she could turn things around. If I can answer, Justice Thomas, she said, her voice clear and strong despite the hostile vibe. Before she could say more, Thomas cut her off again, being rude on purpose. Oh, please, tell us how you're going to fix all these big mistakes. Everyone in the room held their breath as Chief Justice Roberts finally spoke up, his voice firm. Justice Thomas, let the representative speak without being interrupted. Thomas stopped, acting like he was doing her a favor. He looked at Crockett with this look that said he thought she was about to fall apart. But what she said next was like a flood of smart, well-researched arguments that not only shut him down, but also made her a legal legend and led to results that shocked the country, including a court decision that changed voting rights forever. But you'll have to wait to see the decision to understand how good her strategy was. Justice Thomas, Crockett started, her voice a mix of strong confidence and determination that grabbed everyone's attention in the room. Before I get into your specific criticisms of my citations, let me quickly explain something. Yes, I'm a congresswoman, but I'm here today as a lawyer with 12 years of experience working on voting rights cases, including successful arguments in front of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals on similar issues. She paused to let that sink in, noticing a few nods from people in the gallery who knew what her credentials meant. About Baker v. Carr, she continued smoothly. My brief clearly says on page 23 what jurisdictional rules it sets for challenges to how how districts are drawn, but it also points out that the Wisconsin law brings up specific questions about discriminatory intent that Baker alone doesn't cover. That's why I included Arlington Heights versus Metropolitan Housing Corp., which gives test for figuring out intent in what lawmakers do. Thomas's face changed slightly, a quick flash of unexpected resistance that suggested he thought this would be easy. But Crockett wasn't backing down. She grabbed a marked page from her folder. As for Crawford versus Marion County, Justice Thomas, I suggest you look again at Justice Stevens's opinion, which says that voter ID laws have to be based on relevant and legitimate state interests that are important enough to justify the burdens they create. My analysis doesn't misread this. It argues that Wisconsin's system fails under this standard because the state's data shows there's no real problem with in-person voter fraud to justify such tough restrictions. People watched silently as she systematically took apart his arguments point by point. Her tone shifted from careful defense to firm command. The gallery was captivated by how the situation had flipped, with the one being questioned now questioning the questioner. About your list of 17 errors, she went on, her confidence growing. I'd appreciate it if you could point them out for the record, because I really believe in my work and I'm ready to address any real mistakes directly. It was a bold move, a direct challenge to back up his claims. Thomas's face clouded over with frustration. He wasn't expecting such a strong response. He answered with greater intensity. Your confidence is misplaced, Ms. Crockett, he snapped, deliberately dropping her title to diminish her. Your way of interpreting things seems to put your political goals above what the Constitution actually says. This court isn't here to push agendas, but to uphold the law fairly. The message was clear. He was calling her not a legal equal, but an outside ideologue. It was a serious accusation coming from a justice, and it landed like a thunderclap. Justice Sotomayor leaned forward, looking concerned. Maybe we can get back to the specific legal questions instead of questioning counsel's motives. But Thomas didn't back down. My concern comes from what appears to be counsel's clear twisting of this court's voter ID rulings. Crockett's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, the only sign that his attack had gotten to her. But her reply was measured yet firm. With all respect, Justice Thomas, I find it interesting that you question my understanding of voting rights law, considering some parts of your own writings on the subject. A sharp intake of breath swept through the room, a direct challenge to a justice's legal thinking. It was a gamble that could make her career or ruin it. As she continued, weaving in historical facts and legal precedents that exposed disagreements in Thomas's record, the exchange soon blew up online, capturing the attention of not just lawyers but regular Americans, and sparking debates that reached far beyond the courtroom and into the heart of the 2024 election. Things got really tense as Crockett went further into it. She stayed calm and pointed out the difference between what people said and what was actually happening. Like with Shelby County v's Holder, she said, you all seemed okay with cutting important parts of the Voting Rights Act because you thought racism in voting was a thing of the past. But in the last 10 years, over 20 states have passed laws that make it harder for people of color to vote, like making them wait longer in cities or removing people from voter lists in minority areas. Thomas looked angry and quickly warned her. You're getting close to disrespecting this court, Crockett replied respectfully. That's not my intention at all, Justice Thomas. I'm just saying that even this court can miss how things are affecting people. I'm not just talking about legal theories today, but about the real problems voters in Wisconsin are facing because of these strict rules. Problems that are just like the discrimination the Voting Rights Act was supposed to stop. The tension was super high. Legal reporters there knew they were seeing something big. A lawyer pushing back against a senior justice with smarts and facts, especially since race and gender were a big part of the issue. Just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, Thomas made a personal attack. Miss Crockett, he said, making her sound less important. You're very passionate, but passion isn't the same as good legal work. I've seen lots of lawyers like you who get too emotional and think that's the same as winning a case, but it usually doesn't help their clients. He was clearly trying to make her look like a beginner who didn't understand how the court worked. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, sensing trouble, tried to change the subject. Can we talk about the Equal Protection Clause in your argument, Miss Crockett? But Thomas kept going. Before we do that, I want you to explain why you think your understanding of the 14th Amendment should overrule years of court decisions that say states get to control how elections are run. He was hinting that she was trying to take too much power for herself. The room went quiet, and everyone watched Crockett. She was ready for this. She had spent weeks reading everything Thomas had ever written, so she could argue against not just his points, but the ideas behind them. She smiled slightly, which surprised Thomas. It wasn't a nervous smile, but one that suggested she was about to launch a strong attack. It would change how people thought about her, making her a star, and maybe changing things like law school classes and even the 2026 elections. But you would have to see it all to know how her words took apart not only his arguments, but the idea that judges are always right. Nobody in that room saw this coming. Crockett was ready. She'd done her homework on Thomas, digging into his past statements before he was a judge. She found some cracks in his support for voting rights. Justice Thomas, she said, her voice serious, looking him right in the eye. He raised an eyebrow, like he wasn't sure what was coming. Before we talk about the 14th Amendment, we need to clear something up. You've said I'm not qualified and just pretending to be a lawyer. That's wrong, and it's kind of funny coming from you. The room went silent. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Crockett was about to turn things around. Since you brought up my qualifications, she continued, arranging her papers, let me tell you a few things. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. You think I'm not tough enough for this? I graduated with honors from the University of Houston Law Center. I've won most of my federal voting rights cases, and I've written briefs that even the Supreme Court has used. Thomas didn't react, but he started tapping his fingers on the bench, which was unusual for him. More importantly, Crockett said, her voice getting sharper, I've seen firsthand how voters are being kept from voting in places like Wisconsin. It's not just made-up stories about fraud. I've seen old people, sick people, and minorities turned away from the polls, even when they have the right to vote. Their stories are awful, and no theory can explain them away. Justices Kagan and Jackson nodded slightly, agreeing with what she was saying. Now, she said, changing her tone, since we're talking about legal skills, Justice Thomas, let's look at your early views on voting rights. A murmur went through the room. It's rare to question a justice's past like that. Roberts looked worried, but Crockett kept going. In 1981, when you were working for the Department of Education, you told the Washington Post that the Voting Rights Act might not be needed anymore. Then, as head of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, you called voting rights laws a federal overreach. But in the years after that, there were many cases of voting discrimination that wouldn't have been fixed without those laws. Thomas's eyes widened a bit. She remembered something he said over 40 years ago. I'm not bringing this up to attack you, she went on, but to show how your views have changed. You're questioning my knowledge of voting rights, but you used to be against the very laws that protect them. Thomas's face darkened. He started to say something to Alito, but Thomas cut him off. He was focused on Crockett. Also, she finished, her voice getting louder, your decision in Brnovich v. Democratic National Committee made it harder to protect voters, going against what Congress intended. Sotomayor smiled a little, and Jackson looked pleased. So, when you say I'm misusing past cases, I have to ask, which cases should we follow? The ones that protect voting rights or the ones that limit them? Thomas snapped back. Counselor, this isn't about me. Your attempt to distract from your weak arguments isn't working. This was the moment Crockett had been waiting for. She stayed calm and said, Justice Thomas, I'm not attacking the court. I'm saying that everyone's views should be questioned, including yours and mine. You said I wasn't qualified and that I was being unfair. I'm just showing how our views on voting law are different. She paused for a moment and then said the line everyone would remember. The difference between us isn't about knowledge. It's about commitment. I've always defended the right to vote for everyone. You've spent your career making it harder, from your early statements to your decisions as a judge. I've supported the Voting Rights Act while you've tried to weaken it at every turn. The room buzzed with excitement. Thomas looked angry. No one had ever challenged him like that in the courtroom. How dare you? He started to say, but Roberts quickly interrupted. Decorum, please. Then, to Crockett, while a good argument is fine, attacking individual justices goes too far. Get back to the topic, she answered respectfully. Of course, Your Honor. I'm sorry if I went too far, but I was just answering Justice Thomas's questions about my qualifications. Everyone knew she was talking about him starting it. Reporters quietly left to write about what had just happened. It was a moment that would not only make headlines, but also start a bigger discussion about responsibility in government. It might even lead to changes in how judges are held accountable. And it would definitely make Crockett a well-known voice as she got ready for some important legislation legislative battle. Once things calmed down a bit, Crockett got right to the heart of the matter. She laid out her legal argument like a pro. The Wisconsin law has three main problems under the Constitution, and the court's past rulings back this up. She walked through it carefully, using past cases to show that the law unfairly affects some people and that there was intent to discriminate, like in the Thornburg and Washington cases. She made it clear enough for anyone to follow, but it was still good enough for the justices. The justices jumped in. Barrett asked about how much proof was needed. Kagan dug into the numbers showing who was affected. Even Gorsuch, who seemed distant before, wanted to know the timeline of the law, showing he was actually interested. Thomas, though, got quiet. He had been aggressive earlier, but now he was just tense, which said a lot. When Alito suggested that Crockett was exaggerating the law's impact, she had a strong response. Justice Alito, if you're concerned about how serious this law is, look at Exhibit C. It has sworn statements from 238 Wisconsin voters who couldn't vote in 2022, even though they tried to follow the rules. She told some tough stories. An old veteran couldn't vote because his driver's license was expired, even though he had his military ID. A mom with a disability couldn't get her birth certificate to vote because she lived in the middle of nowhere. A student couldn't use her college ID because the rules had changed. These aren't just possibilities, Crockett said, really meaning it. These are real American citizens who are being denied their right to vote by rules that seem fair, but aren't. These stories made an impact. Even conservatives like Barrett seemed worried about the veteran, thinking about how this affected real people. When time was running out, Roberts said, 2 minutes left, Miss Crockett. She replied respectfully. She finished strong. This case isn't about politics or theories. It's about whether people can vote without unfair barriers. The Wisconsin law puts big obstacles in the way of older people, people with disabilities, poor people, and minorities, groups that the court has always tried to protect. She spoke with passion, but stayed calm. Voting isn't just a basic right. It protects all our freedoms. When laws keep eligible people from voting and disproportionately hurt certain groups, the court has a duty to fix it. The Constitution changes with the times, and in Wisconsin, blocking votes goes against what our country stands for. It's right to strike down the law, and it's the fair thing to do. Thank you. After she sat down, the room was silent. Everyone was thinking about what she said, not just her legal skills, but how she stood up to Thomas. The Wisconsin Solicitor General got up to argue, but the momentum had shifted. Everyone's attention was on Crockett. Thomas was stiff and out of sorts. Little did everyone know, someone had secretly filmed the whole thing, and it was already going viral. This would create a huge media storm that would overshadow the case and turn Crockett into a major player whose words would spark action and challenge the way things are, impacting public debate for years to come. We'll see how this plays out through the chaos and ultimate victory. After the session ended, chaos erupted outside the courtroom. Court staff had to make a path for Crockett as reporters swarmed her, shouting questions like, "Did you expect Justice Thomas to be so aggressive? And why did you look into his past?" Crockett stayed calm and said simply, "My job was to defend the constitutional rights of millions of voters. I believe the court will carefully consider the evidence." But inside the justices' chambers, they had a rare, unplanned meeting after the arguments. Roberts was very worried, saying, "These personal attacks hurt the court's reputation, no matter who starts them." Sotomayor defended Crockett, asking what else could she do when her knowledge was constantly being questioned. Thomas was silent, but clearly upset. Alito defended Thomas, saying Crockett's response was disrespectful. Kagan replied that respect goes both ways. Outside the court, the situation exploded online and on TV. A short clip of Crockett's reply got 10 million views on X in hours, and Dadayash Crockett dismantles. Thomas was trending. Cable news shows jumped on the story. Neil Katyal on CNN praised it as a perfect example of advocacy under pressure, combining facts with poise. She didn't just survive, she made the discussion better. Laura Ingraham on Fox called it a rude display disguised as law, though even conservative commentator Carrie Severino admitted Thomas's unusually personal questioning was out of line. Joyce Vance on MSNBC celebrated the critical moment of a black lawyer defending herself against a justice's attack on her credentials with undeniable facts. Her accuracy made it impossible to argue with. When asked, Biden said carefully, "I won't comment on ongoing cases, but I will say that everyone in a courtroom courtroom deserves respect. Trump raged on Truth Social. Great patriot Justice Thomas attacked by left-wing radicals. Crockett should apologize for disrespecting our judiciary. Groups like the American Bar Association called for everyone to be respectful but praised the importance of strong debate. The National Bar Association of Black attorneys praised Crockett's amazing mind for standing up to unfair insults. Professors quickly started discussing the situation. Lawrence Tribe at Harvard called the exchange required learning for constitutional law, and schools across the country used it as an example of strong speaking. Profiles showed that Crockett had prepared carefully. She had studied Thomas's writings thoroughly, from his early articles to his recent dissents, not to get revenge, but to be ready for attacks on her expertise. Mentors praised her. Charles Ogletree, who taught Obama, called her a brilliant legal mind of her generation. Her online following grew by 2 million. Schumer praised her passion and skill, while Johnson criticized the disrespect toward a respected judge and ethics. Investigation was dropped because she was acting as a lawyer, and her evidence was solid. The event even entered pop culture. An SNL skit by Ego and Wodim got 20 million views on YouTube. Time magazine put her on the cover as the rebutter who rattled the robes, exploring the problems of representation. The Congressional Black Caucus declared this was more than just two people arguing. It questioned whether black women lawyers can defend themselves in ways that others can't. Experts analyzed the situation. Paul Butler on CNN said Crockett changed the pattern of interrupting women of color, making her actions a model for fair courtroom behavior. After the exchange, Thomas asked fewer questions and was less aggressive in court. Crockett's speaking schedule filled up, and her Howard address focused on equal constitutional rights for every vote, regardless of who you are. Behind the scenes, the conflict grew. Liberals started writing a strong rejection, while Thomas and Alito wrote a strong dissent. The swing votes, Roberts, Barrett, and Kavanaugh, were unsure. Barrett began reading about Crockett's work with voters. 4 months later, the court ruled 5-4 against the law, with Roberts and Barrett siding with the majority. Roberts wrote, "Taking away someone's right to vote requires a very high level of review." Barrett agreed, "The evidence shows troubling cases of veterans and vulnerable people being excluded." Thomas's dissent was harsh, saying, "Emotional arguments distract from correct legal thinking." Celebrations followed. Tribe called it the biggest win for voting rights in decades, and Crockett's involvement was key. Crockett said modestly, "This is a victory for voters everywhere. Barriers have been broken down." The Crockett catalyst became a symbol of the power of factual arguments. Teachers taught about it, and Thomas became more subdued. Her voting rights vanguard nonprofit grew and gained more supporters. Looking back, she said, "It's not about individuals, but about those who are silenced. The elderly person in the South, the veteran in line, the young person working hard. Respectful challenge is how justice works. No one is above the truth." If this whole story about standing up and sticking to beliefs has you hooked, wondering what could happen and seeing things change because someone wouldn't back down, then help us out. Smash the like button. Subscribe for more stories about political secrets that the big guys don't want you to know, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any news we send your way.